Hey guys, it is time to break out the calculators and amateur statistics books because we have an anomaly. Magnus Carlsen only days ago played a 44-game blitz marathon against one of the strongest blitz experts in existence, the great Daniel Naroditsky, the first 35 games of which went pretty much how you'd expect. Magnus winning 19 games, Daniel winning 13 with 3 draws, so Magnus underperforming just a bit, losing about 30 rating points, which shouldn't be a huge deal, but to the Magnus, it was apparently enough to awaken his inner beast and send him into what we like to refer to as God mode, and even beyond that, because what he did next was damn near adopt Naroditsky by winning 9 games straight. So better notify Kramnik so he can tell us whether or not this is possible without cheating, while simultaneously making no comment on whether or not Magnus is cheating. But better yet, maybe we should just do the math ourselves. Little known fact about me, I have been working with probabilities and statistics at the amateur level since I was about 14 when I started to try to calculate poker probabilities. So toward the end of this video, I'm going to apply what I know to this 9-game winning streak, so stick around for that. But right now, I want to show you a few of these games from this epic winning streak, starting with my favorite one where Magnus brutally checkmates Dania on move 22. So it begins with e4, Magnus has the white pieces. We have the Sicilian defense from Dania, and then Magnus going Fischer style with bishop to c4, and after knight to f6, knight to c3, knight to c6, here comes d4, c takes d4, the pawns are exchanged. I'm just loving this mainline theory from Dania, so solid. What could go wrong? Well, probably nothing as long as you're sticking to the main line, but Dania doesn't do that. After bishop to e3 from Magnus, working towards castling queenside, after which he will go for his standard kingside attack, we have a bit of an unusual move from Dania, queen to c7. Maybe a bit premature. More common here is a6 or bishop to e7. Now I will show you why the engine doesn't like this move in a minute. We have queen to e2 from Magnus, supporting this bishop, preparing to castle. a6 from Dania, looking to begin the queenside assault with b5 at some point. And after castles long, here black would love to immediately strike with b5, but that would be a blunder, failing to knight takes c6, queen takes c6, and then knight takes b5, winning a pawn. For if black were to capture that knight with a takes b5, then bishop takes b5 would pin the queen to the king and would win. A variation which demonstrates why the engine did not like the move queen to c7 earlier, saying that black should have defended that knight with bishop to d7 instead, and then you could get in that move b5 sooner. But getting back to the game, Dania of course avoided the b5 disaster, playing bishop to e7, preparing to castle, after which b5 will be possible. Magnus foresees that, doesn't want this move coming with an attack on his bishop, and so prophylactically drops it back to b3. Now at this point, instead of castling like he should, Dania decides he can take on d4, and after the recapture, he goes straight for b5. Not worried about his king being in the center, but he should be, because Magnus has a very strong move here, which he doesn't play, but that move is e5. Since after d takes e5, bishop takes e5, things are getting a bit awkward for black. There are threats involving bishop takes f6. For example, I'll show you just one line. Queen to c6, you have bishop takes f6, and here as black you have to take with the g-pawn. If you were to play bishop takes f6, there would be bishop to d5. This e-pawn is pinned by the queen, can't capture the bishop, and black is losing. And there's some more variations that we could look at, but suffice to say that in this position, Dania should not have played b5, giving Magnus this opportunity to break open the center with e5. But Magnus misses e5, he's fixated on his kingside assault, and he plays g4. Just gifting that e5 move to Dania, who didn't play it either, apparently missing that it's a double attack, hitting the bishop as well as the pawn on g4 with 2 pieces. So after the bishop moves, there comes bishop takes g4, hitting the queen. White has dropped the pawn for the moment, but he does have this move knight to d5 with the counter attack on the black queen, and is still actually a bit better according to the engine, but not by much. But instead of this, Dania played bishop to b7, allowing g5, driving the knight back. Magnus plays f4, defending g5 now, and bishop takes g7 is a threat, so Dania decides to castle, at which point Magnus, setting his sights on Dania's king side, which is a bit lacking in defensive resources, decides to go full caveman with rook to d3, with the barbaric idea of simply playing rook to h3, queen to h5, and delivering checkmate on h7. What could be simpler? Well, the only problem is it doesn't work, unless Dania allows it to. Now, the engine liked a3 better because the engine always seems to like a3 in these types of positions. I guess here it's holding up b4 and it's giving the bishop the a2 square to drop back to in response to knight to c5, which is the move Dania needs to play next, but he doesn't play it. Now, the reason knight c5 is best is because it puts a question to this rook. Where are you going? If you commit to the caveman attack with rook to h3, then g6 is a good defense for black, keeping that queen out of h5. Now, she can still get to h4 in a couple moves, but h4 is not a good square for that queen. There will be no checkmate on h7. Maybe you see why, but if you don't, you will in a moment. Another important detail is the fact that the rook on h3 is blocking the h-pawn. If this wasn't the case, then h4 would be coming much too quickly, looking to exchange itself for the pawn on g6, open the h-file, and black would be in a lot of trouble. But now let's take a look at what Dania played. Instead of the correct knight to c5, we have e5, which is a fatal blunder because it allows queen to h5, played now by Magnus, completely ignoring his attacked bishop on d4, which black has no time to capture. For if e takes d4, we of course would have rook to h3, and how are you stopping the checkmate on h7? h6? Well, it doesn't take much imagination to realize that g takes h6 is going to end very poorly for black. So Dania, being the elite player he is, did not take the bishop. He instead opted for g6, which is equally losing, though not necessarily as quickly or as obviously. This move is depriving the white queen's access to f7, which is also hit by the bishop, because Dania needs to move his rook next so that he can play knight to f8 and defend h7. That's the plan. So Magnus moves his queen to her best square, which is h6. Now, remember how I told you that h4 was not a good square for the queen? If the queen were on h4 instead, black would have h5, just shutting down the entire attack by taking advantage of the pin on the g-pawn. You cannot take en passant here unless you want to lose your queen. But with Magnus's queen on h6, you got to move your rook off of f8, which Dania does, so that after rook to h3, you can defend that h7 square with knight to f8. So what do we have now? Dania is in kind of a passive defensive position, but how does white proceed? Well, Magnus starts with f takes e5. Now Dania, to his credit, realizes that he needs to be proactive, not reactive. He needs to go on the offensive here. If he were to just recapture that pawn, then rook to f1 would cause a big disaster on f7. The pawn is pinned, hit twice. What are you doing? Nothing. Checkmate is inevitable. So let's see what Dania tried instead. He played queen to d8. Okay, threatening bishop takes g5 with check, winning the white queen. And how would you deal with this as white? I mean, forget about saving the g-pawn. Can you find a way to even save your queen? I encourage you to pause the video here and take a look at the position and try to anticipate the move that Magnus played next. In 3, 2, 1. e6 is the spectacular queen sacrifice that Magnus found that will force checkmate in another 12 moves. Bishop takes g5 check, and you gotta wonder if Dania thought for a moment that Magnus was having some kind of cognitive issue here, maybe even a medical emergency. And did he maybe even feel a little guilty for taking advantage like this? Well, if he did, it didn't last long, because after Magnus moved his king to b1, Dania apparently realized the horrific truth, and that is that Magnus was in excellent mental health, and that if he were to capture the queen with bishop takes h6, then e takes f7 check would be a very lovely checkmate. Look at those two bishops working together. So Dania did not capture the queen, but before I show you what he played, I'm going to show you what his best line of play would have been, assuming it's better to get mated later rather than sooner. So the engine line for black here is knight takes e6, giving the king a square on f8 so that after queen takes h7 check, you can move there. And I'll go ahead and show you the checkmate in 9 from here. It begins with bishop takes e6. And if you capture that bishop, then mate comes very quickly, beginning with queen to g7. So instead, you should defend f7 with the queen. And then here comes the knight, hitting e7, threatening queen to h8 mate. Best move is to take it out. And after e takes d5, white now has the unstoppable threat of rook to f1, followed by the capture on f7, which the engine is going to delay as long as possible with rook takes c2, rook to f1, and then rook to c1 check. We have rook takes c1, and then it's going to try to run with the king to e7. To no avail. After rook to f1, the bishop's put in the way, the bishop's captured, the king goes to d8, and now a nice move, bishop to b6. The king must go back to e7. It's the only move, after which rook takes f7 check, and queen takes, followed by queen takes f7, is checkmate. So that's how Stockfish envisions the game ending. But Dania made life just slightly easier for Magnus in the game. In this position here, Dania was apparently so fixated on what this e-pawn could do that he just totally missed what it left behind when it was pushed to e6. And that is that this diagonal was opened for the dark squared bishop. And so after Dania's next move, f takes e6, Magnus Carlsen very quickly spotted, as I'm sure the vast majority of my viewers will as well, the checkmate in one move, queen to g7 checkmate. So mind-blowing stuff as usual from Magnus, playing with such precision and brilliance with such a limited amount of time, just seconds for each move. It's really hard to fathom, but we're not finished. I'm going to show you a couple more games from this 9-win streak. I'm not going to go through all the moves, I just want to show you how they ended, and then we'll talk statistics. Okay, so in this game, Magnus has black. He's just moved his queen to h4, targeting h2, and also threatening knight takes e3, followed by the winning of the knight on e4. So this is another good training position. Dania's only got one good defense here. See if you can spot it in 3, 2, 1. Bishop takes g4 is how you got to begin as white, opening the eyes of the rook so it can defend the bishop on e3, so that after knight takes g4, you can play knight to f3, defending h2, hitting the queen, and if knight takes e3, with the counterattack on the white queen, you can recapture on e3 with the rook. If this move wasn't possible, then white would just be losing. That's why the bishop was traded, so the rook could capture there. But going back to the game, Dania instead just tried moving that bishop on e3 to f4, where it's guarding h2. But now Magnus strikes with bishop takes e4, removing the defense of f2, so that after queen takes e4, there's queen takes f2 check. Now Dania's king does escape to h1, and Magnus has grabbed a pawn, but it looks like he ought to have more. Where is the follow-up though? See if you can find black's best move now. In 3, 2, 1. Magnus played queen takes e1 check, which caused Dania to immediately resign, seeing that rook takes e1 would be met with knight to f2 check. It is a fork. Dania will lose his queen and be down a whole rook. So it's all about tactics, guys. So study them tactics. Okay, I got one more for you. Here it's Magnus to move with the white pieces, and we have yet another example of Naroditsky neglecting his king's safety. I think a lot of you can guess what Magnus played here. Pause the video if you want, but here it comes. Bishop takes h6. And after g takes h6, of course queen takes h6, threatening mate on h7. Gotta give the king a square, so rook f to e8. And how many of us would give in to the temptation to play queen to h7 with check and let the king escape, throwing away the entire win for white? It's an easy thing to do in a blitz game, but Magnus knows to keep that queen on h6. For as long as possible, he plays knight to g5, covering h7, and so threatening a checkmate, which Dania does not prevent with his next move, knight to e5. Although he had no great way to prevent it without dropping a lot of material. But now we have the mate in 2, beginning with bishop to h7 check, king to h8 is the only move, and now queen to f6, checkmate. The knight, of course, is protecting the bishop on h7. Very nice, so clean, Magnus playing almost flawlessly in game after game, resulting in those 9 consecutive wins, which seems incredible against a player of Dania's caliber, but just how unlikely was it? How significant is a winning streak like that, statistically speaking? Was this a freak occurrence? Should we be suspicious that Magnus is cheating? Well, to answer that, I am going to use my layman's understanding of how probabilities work, and what I'll do first is take a look at the rating difference between Magnus and Dania right before this winning streak began. Magnus was rated 3261 on chess.com and Dania rated 3174, a difference of a little less than 100 rating points. Now, if you go to this ELO performance calculator here and input the ratings, it's going to tell you that Magnus should score about 62% against Dania on average based on their difference in rating. Now, if you assume that there will be no draws, which here you can do without affecting things too much, since in Blitz, Magnus and Dania have a very low draw rate, with only 3 of their 44 games ending in draws, we can say Magnus has around a 62% chance of winning each game. So from here, calculating the odds of a 62% chance event happening 9 times in a row is fairly straightforward. You just multiply 0.62 by itself 9 times, like so, and you get 0.013537, or about a 1 in 74 chance of happening. It's amazing to see just how much the odds change with relatively slight changes in rating. You can see that if you are evenly matched against an opponent with the exact same rating as you, your odds of a 9-game streak are only about 1 in 512. But there is something that these probabilities do not take into account at all. Something very important, and that is the human element. And perhaps more importantly, the phenomenon of getting tilted. Now, I don't know about you, but when I have been playing worse than I think I should be playing, and I get angry about it, I do not start playing better. For me, and I think for most people, anger is not conducive to clear thinking and only amplifies the problem, making me play even worse than before. So getting tilted like this, from my own experience, it feels like it makes my playing strength drop by at least 200 rating points, if not more. It really makes a huge difference. So this is something we always have to take into account when looking at these human games, because I think for most people, the more games you lose in a row, the more likely it becomes that you will continue to lose. Of course, some people are more susceptible to this than others. It really all depends on just how much it bothers you to lose and how much you let that affect your play. So I don't know if Kramnik takes this phenomenon of getting tilted into account during his ramblings, but he really should, and it would be interesting to study this effect to see how much it actually affects the average chess player. Now, of course, there are other potential factors as well besides being tilted that could affect the likelihood of a given winning streak occurring. Maybe one player is not playing at their normal strength because they are tired, maybe they are distracted, maybe they're having a conversation with someone or even an argument with their spouse about how they play too much online chess. All of these things could make someone play below their normal rating level, and as we saw from the chart, that can make a huge difference. For instance, if Daniel Naroditsky began to get tilted after losing a few games to Magnus, and his playing strength dropped by only 100 points, so he's playing like a 30-74 player instead of a 31-74, the odds of Magnus having a 9-game win streak becomes 1 in 12, so quite a big difference compared to a 1 in 74, and I think this is what might be happening in a lot of these instances where someone has a winning streak in Blitz. Of course, classical chess games are a completely different story. Maybe I'll cover that in a future video, but for now, I'm out of here. I hope you enjoyed these beautiful performances by Magnus Carlsen. Please subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this content, and I will see you very soon.